Welcome back to our continuing walk through the Genesis creation days. If this is your first time on the channel, my name is JM, and welcome to Disciple Dojo. This is a ministry that seeks to help people go deeper in their understanding of Scripture, in their community with fellow disciples, whether through in-person events or through online community. And just as in a martial arts dojo, you go and you learn and you train and you struggle and you sweat, and at the end of the day, you leave better than when you got there. That is our desire here at Disciple Dojo, for you to enter and to strain and sweat and struggle as you form your own biblical theology. Discipleship is not just about regurgitating what other people have taught, but it's about learning how to think biblically, faithfully, prayerfully, and how to engage the culture around us. So all of that is what we do here at Disciple Dojo, and all of that is entirely donor funded. So if you appreciate this ministry and you'd like to partner with us, we're not begging for money. We're just simply saying this is the need. Ministry takes money, funding, and so we rely on the generosity of God's people rather than bait and switch or selling our teaching resources or anything like that. We just trust that God will handle all of that. And the way he does that primarily is through those of you who believe in what we're doing and want to tangibly support us. And another way that you can tangibly support this ministry is by clicking that little subscribe button and clicking the notifications bell here on YouTube. That really helps us. That helps us grow our channel, which helps us then reach more people. It lets YouTube know, hey, there's a viewership out there for long-form, in-depth biblical teaching and scholarly discussions, study Bible reviews, superhero seminary videos. If you're wondering what the action figures behind me are, check out our superhero seminary playlist here on the channel, and you'll see why these esteemed faculty members are surrounding me. But with all of that said, let's jump right back into Genesis chapter 1, the creation week, day 4. So as we saw in previous videos, if you haven't seen any of the previous videos and this is your first time, I'll drop a link in the description below. The first 3 days so far, God has created and ordered and separated and put into place day and night. On day 2, he put into place the waters and the sky, the rakia. And on day 3, he brought forth in 2 creative acts, first the land, the dry land, and then the vegetation on the land. And so now we're going to come to Yom Ravi'i, day 4. Here's what we read. Verse 14, God said, "Let there be lights in the rakia of the sky." Now, catch our video on day 2 for why I'm leaving rakia untranslated. This Hebrew word, it's hard to render into English. And if you want to see why I prefer the translation expansive dome for rakia instead of firmament or just expanse, check out this article I wrote. It just got published last week over on the Logos website, where we do a deeper dive into how rakia should be translated and how it would have been pictured by the ancients. I'll link that as well in the description below if you prefer to read a little bit more on it and look up some of the citations and some of the footnotes and some of the other passages where the term is used. But for now, in this video series, I'm just leaving rakia untranslated, but just know it refers to that expansive dome above us, which is how this liturgical creation text denotes the sky. God said, "Let there be lights in the rakia of the sky to distinguish between day and night, and let them be for signs, festivals, days, and years." Now, some translations, a lot of translations, will not translate this as festivals. It'll say something like signs, seasons, days, and years. You could translate this word, lemoadim, as seasons, but Moedim is just the plural of moed, and moed is the word for festivals, gatherings. So don't think of seasons like winter, spring, summer, fall, but for seasonal gatherings centered around the agricultural year in Israel. The entire Hebrew calendar was based around the yearly agricultural cycle. And so here on this day 4, God is putting in place the way that those seasons, those festivals will be timed. That is by the position of the greater light and the lesser light, the sun determining the year and the day, the moon determining the month, the festival. Even today, a number of Jewish festivals are based on when the new moon is first spotted. So the moon and the sun, the greater light and the lesser light, are put in place in the Genesis account specifically for their purpose in telling time, and in particular, agricultural and sacred time. And so verse 15, and let them provide light in the rakia of the sky to shine over the land. And thus it was. God made the 2 great lights, the greater light for dominion over the day. This is important. This word dominion, memsheleth in Hebrew. This is going to come into play later. So just keep it in mind when God puts these greater light and the lesser light in place in the rakia firmament, it is specifically to tell time. And then he says, and let them have dominion over, or this could be translated as have rule over or reign over. So the greater light for dominion over the day, and the lesser light for dominion over the night and the stars. And this literally, et hakokabim, is just almost like a little throwaway, like, oh yeah, and the stars. The stars are included as an afterthought. Now, this whole section in the Hebrew text is really interesting. One, you notice the words shamash or yareah, sun and moon, they're not used. It's greater light and lesser light, bigger light and smaller light. Why would they not use the names, the common words that are found everywhere throughout the Hebrew Bible for sun and moon? Well, interpreters have suggested a number of reasons, and one of them that I personally find compelling is this is a subtle undermining of other ancient Near East cosmologies. Other ancient Near East cosmologies, you had the sun and the moon as chief gods. In Mesopotamia, the moon god was one of the primary deities. In Egypt, the sun god was the primary deity. And not only that, but in all of the ancient world, and even in the modern world today, people are really into horoscopes, the stars determine everything. The stars determine what kind of day you're going to have today. The stars determine what kind of attitude you have, whether you're introvert, extrovert. You hear people say all the time, oh, that's such a Scorpio thing to do. Oh, I'm a Leo. Don't blame me for this. The stars, that's nothing new. The stars, going back to the ancient Babylonians and even before, the stars were seen as almost deities, cosmic entities, things that either guided or determined or foretold events on the earth. And so the Genesis account in Genesis 1, it's like it's going out of its way to deify, I don't know if that's a word, but I'm going to use it, the creation around us, and specifically the things that were deified by Israel's ancient neighbors. So no, you don't have Shamash, which is the name of the sun god. No, you just have the greater light. You don't have the moon, you just have the lesser light. And the stars barely even get a mention, which is just utterly mind-boggling to ancient neighbors of Israel. So God says, let these lights be in the expanse, the rakia, the firmament, however you want to translate it. Verse 17, God put them in the rakia of the sky to shine upon the land, to have dominion. There's the word again, and this time it's a simple infinitive, to rule over, to have dominion over the day and over the night, and to separate between the light and dark. That echoes back to the first creation day when God separated the light and dark. Now he's more specifically separating them, or putting in place this greater light and this lesser light, which are going to separate the day and the night. God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, a fourth day. So what we have on this day 4 is the sun and the moon and the stars, the heavenly bodies. Now, at this point, ancient readers, even long before modern cosmology, modern astronomy, long before any of that, ancient readers of the text noticed something peculiar. You have 3 days, yom, before you have a sun. How does that work? How do you have 3 days? Because a day is just a measure of the Earth's position in relationship to the sun. So a day is evening and morning, sunset, sunrise. That is in all reckonings throughout the Bible. That's how a day is counted. So how can you have 3 days before the sun is even created? And there's a couple of ways interpreters have handled this. Some have said, well, these days are just 24-hour days, and God created light, and it wasn't sunlight that these days were being measured with. It was some other light, God's light, some other heavenly light. And it wasn't until day 4 that he created the sun and put it into place. Others have said, well, that kind of goes against the typical meaning of day. So even that interpretation is anything but a literal reading of the text. And so they have said this is phenomenological language. These days are not 24-hour days. They're long periods of time, whether thousands of years, like some of the ancient readers would have suggested, or millions or even billions of years, as some modern scientific readers suggest. Regardless, the length of a day is an indeterminate amount of time, and we know because there was no sun, moon, or stars in this account that whatever these first 3 days are, they're not literal 24-hour solar days. And therefore, we're free to interpret them as ages, epochs in human history, stages of the creation of the earth. And so for somebody who takes that approach, someone who's more concordist, they would say, so if you look at these days as periods of time, geological ages, it kind of makes sense given what we know about planetary formation. That the sun and the moon and the stars, they were already created in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. Well, that was when God created the heavens and the earth, so they're already there. These days are from the perspective of someone who is on the earth. Genesis 1:2, now the earth was tohu vavohu, and darkness was over the face of the waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the deep. Well, that's letting you know that the perspective for the rest of Genesis 1 is from the vantage point of someone on the earth. And so if that's the case, then phenomenologically describing something just in normal everyday language, this seems to fit with how we know the earth formed. At the beginning, the earth was this primordial, watery, soupy, thick atmosphere that wasn't transparent. And it was thick and dark. And then as the Earth's rotation started to slow down over time, the atmosphere itself settled out and thinned out. And so you had eventually this translucent atmosphere that you would be able to distinguish day from night, just like we do on a cloudy day, but it wasn't transparent. You would not be able to see any heavenly bodies outside of the atmosphere. So for this age, this day, you would have light and dark, and you would be able to distinguish them. Then as the atmosphere continued to thin, the waters would settle and the sky, the actual atmosphere, would start to thin out more. And so now you would have this watery, primeval body of planetary debris clumped together through gravity with comets hitting it and bringing it water. And that's then what we have in the early Earth. And an atmosphere would start to separate out from that. And you would have this watery, thick haze atmosphere above, but you would have a sky. You would have oxygen and nitrogen and all the other stuff that are in the atmosphere. And the other water, the heavier water and particles and all that would make up the earth below. But it was still this watery mass. And then in the next age, through plate tectonics, through geological upheaval, you would start to get the continents rising and the waters being gathered into the seas. And so by day 3, if these days are long ages, you have now the early Earth's continental formation. And then through life that emerged on the earth as it came up through the water, microbial life, whatever, you had vegetation coming into being. You had photosynthesis being able to take place, and you had green plants, vegetation starting to appear on this dry land. And this is all over millions and billions of years. And then in the next age, the atmosphere finally is transparent enough to where now, for the first time, the sun, the moon, and the stars can be visible from somebody who's standing on the earth. And so that's what you have, Concordus would say, on day 4, is you have, for the first time, the sun, the moon, and the stars are visible. And so the creation account can say, so God put them there on that day. They also note that the Hebrew tense system, and we talked about this in the second video in this series, Hebrew doesn't have as many verb tenses. And there's grammatically no difference between a Hebrew perfect and a Hebrew pluperfect. So in other words, verse 16 can read, God created the 2 great lights, but this verb, vayas, can also be translated, God had made. It can also be a pluperfect. And so Concordus would say this should be, if we want to be precise, we can translate it that way. Just like it happens in Exodus 19. We looked at that example in an earlier video. That's what's going on here, that God had made the greater lights. And then in verse 17, God had put them in the rakia of the sky. So Concordus would say there's really no contradiction. God's not creating the sun, the moon, and the stars on this day, but rather through using normal everyday phenomenological language, the sun, the moon, and the stars that God had created when in the beginning of his creation of the heavens and the earth, he did all this stuff. Those are now being displayed in the rakia. So that's another way that Concordus would approach this text, as opposed to so-called literalists who would say, no, these are just 24-hour days. Then lastly, you would have functional view proponents who would say, none of these days are even really giving us chronology. This is a heavily stylized account. It's patterned after a typical Hebrew work week, where you have God as the ancient builder. It has this 2-tiered system. You have God speaking things from the heavenly realm, and then you have things happening on the earth, and it's done in orderly ways. There's a pattern here. There's artistry at work. So to press this for narrative or scientific precision is to fundamentally misread the text. It doesn't mean this didn't happen. It doesn't mean this is myth or made up. What it means is that God is revealing creation theologically, not chronologically. And elsewhere in Scripture, chronology is not in ancient Hebrew and even in ancient Greek what it is for us today. Authors move things around chronologically in order to write thematically. So for instance, in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus' cleansing of the temple, driving out the money changers, that is placed at the end of his ministry. Whereas in John's Gospel, which is much more thematic, the author of the Gospel of John front loads that event in the beginning of Jesus' ministry, or near the beginning of Jesus' ministry, because it fits with the theme of what he's talking about in that early part of the gospel. And that was not seen as a problem in the ancient world, only for modern readers' standards, where we're in a post-historiography world where we want a timeline and linear flow and everything to be in the right order. Only for us is that an issue, but for the ancient reader, it wasn't. And so similarly, in the ancient Near East, an account that speaks thematically of the different realms, the different things that God's bringing into being, they're not focused on the chronology of it. And they're really, John Walton, for instance, would argue, they're really not even focused on the material aspect of it, like God actually creating the thing, but they're more focused on God bringing about the order and the function of the thing, which in this case, the thing is the universe, creation. So people who take that approach would say we shouldn't press any of the details for any degree of concordism, because the text is just not trying to give us scientific information, geological information, biological information, astronomical information. It's intending to give us theological information. And it's doing so in a highly stylized, artistic, semi-poetic genre of elevated prose, liturgical narration. And so this is where we are by day 4 of the creation account, bringing into being, putting into place the sun, the moon, and the stars. Key point, the key takeaway, the author of Genesis is not concerned with the material nature of the sun, moon, or stars. The author of Genesis is concerned with the covenantal significance of the sun, the moon, and the stars. And in doing so, sets them in a vastly different characterization than you find in other ancient Near East texts. They're just the greater light, the lesser light. Oh yeah, also those stars. Their purpose is to shine upon the earth, to govern, to rule over, to have dominion over. Remember that term, it's going to come into play later. To have dominion over the day and the night, to shine upon the earth, and so that God's people will be able to tell days, years, festivals, signs, seasons. So they're not deities. They're not to be worshiped. They're not even to be personified. They're aspects of creation. And this earth is still awaiting its culmination in this creation week. But we've got a couple of more days to go before we get there. So in the meantime, if you haven't seen the previous videos in this series, I invite you to go back and check them out. Once again, if you're more interested in why I'm choosing to not translate rakia, or when I do, I say like expansive dome, check out the article I've written over at Logos. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to help support long-form, in-depth biblical teaching here on YouTube and all of the other various ministries Disciple Dojo does, then please remember to subscribe, click the notifications icon, like, share this video, or any of our other resources. That's all for now, and we'll see you back for the 5th day in our next video. Take care and keep training.